Thank you, Mr. Reisberman, for setting the stage for this conversation and for talking about the challenges of nutrition, and challenges which, if we don't deal with them now, they will lead us to very, very serious trouble and what we are calling the triple burden. And the triple burden you will hear about more carefully later on in a few minutes. And it's basically the result of not thinking of those challenges, of not acting to take care of those challenges on time. That's why I would like to call on stage Mr. Barry Popkin. He's a professor of the University of North Carolina, and he will be talking about the nutritional triple burden in Latin America's heavyweight champions. And of course, once this stage has been set, we can go more into detail of those problems, the solutions, and how to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. By the way, I have both a PhD in agricultural economics and a couple masters in economics, plus the nutrition hat. So I kind of have lived in both worlds, and I'm going to try to talk a little bit about background before moving on. I really want to talk about one specific issue because our food system today is so different than it was 30 and 40 years ago. And it's become such a major driver. And it's not just retailers, it's food service, agribusiness, food companies. But I want to begin by getting us to realize that the drivers today were the drivers that created our evolution, that allowed us to survive centuries and millennia ago, eating sweet foods like berries. We needed them to survive, to have a balanced diet. We needed to drink water every 3 or 4 days or we die. If you don't drink water within 7 days, you die, essentially. But you cannot eat food for 2 months. So we had food scarcity, but we had to keep drinking water. And even when we had our animals or whatever to kill. So for some reason, our drinking and our eating mechanisms are separate. What we drink doesn't affect what we eat. So if we go from drinking water to drinking soft drinks, you know what happens. Similarly, we needed fatty food. We needed calories. We needed it to survive. We needed it when it was available. So all those all those biological developments happened over thousands of years that created the species we are today, along with going from the fire to the wheel to technology. And so we had these things happening, but we didn't have modern technology. That's really something that has so accelerated in the last 20 to 40 years. That is why we have a world that's getting fat. That is why we have this triple burden emerging, and we have to keep that in mind. And we have to keep in mind, I think that's probably where we moved from 1950 in Latin America to a time when we had lots of hunger. All of my focus when I began my career from the nutrition and agriculture side was on food and hunger. Maternal child nutrition was the problem. Poor weaning foods. Acute malnutrition was ripe throughout all the Andean region and parts of Brazil and Argentina. It was a country where we had frank malnutrition across the region as well as across the globe and all of Africa, Asia, Latin America. And we really have moved forward. But as we move forward, we've gotten rid of acute malnutrition. We don't have starving people anymore in Latin America and Central America at all. We do in Africa. We certainly do in South Asia, but not in this region. So we've shifted. But as we shifted, our food system shifted. We increased what we're eating. We're eating a diet like, whoops, I'm not doing very well with this pointer. I should have brought my own over. Anyway, our diet is really a diet of that's really shifted. Our activity patterns have shifted drastically. We'll never increase our activity patterns like they were 50 years ago or 30 or 20. So we must think about our food system. And that is indeed what my previous speaker really talked about and what I'm going to go on in some other ways. We need to move to this healthy diet, this sustainable healthy diet that Carlos Monteros will talk about later. And we'd like to move activity up, and we'd like to get to this healthy weight that we don't seem to find in this world at this point. But our food system has really changed. And this is a very messy slide, but when I started working in Asia in the 60s, and then worked in the Philippines in the 70s, and worked with Erie and others when we were doing rural studies. The food system was controlled by government. We had a very simple agricultural system. Government subsidized, produced. The CGIAR and others created the Green Revolution. It was a different system. Today, food retailers, agribusinesses, food service companies, global food companies go directly to farmers. All throughout Asia, where I work with large surveys, we find the farmers are selling to these other agents. The government's roles are really changing, and our roles really are changing as we have these new drivers. And that's part of the reason why countries like Mexico, Chile, and others, as were mentioned by our colleagues before, are doing what they're doing to try to create a healthy diet. We're taxing things, we're regulating things, we're marketing things. I wish I could talk about that, but I'm talking about a different issue today. But we need to move forward, and we need to change our agricultural system, and we need to change what we're eating, or we're all going to become looking like not our Botero, but it's the same. And so now I want to start. I want to start first with women of childbearing age, because we have surveys across the Americas, a reasonable number that give us on nationally representative basis what it looks like. So today, for women, if I would have gone back 25 or 30 years ago, you would have had more malnourished women in black on the left and the right in rural and urban areas than overweight and obese women. Today it has completely changed. And you look here at the prevalence, you see in every one of the countries in urban and rural areas, and Nicaragua's old data from 2001. The rest are from the last 3 or 4 years. So you see in all of them, we're talking about large proportions of women being overweight, very tiny amounts of malnutrition. So we've solved the adult problem. The adolescent problem I'm not going to go into, we haven't solved it. But I want to give you a little feel of the change. So this is the annualized change in the Americas. Brazil, which had really cut overweight and obesity in the 90s, all of a sudden is leading the way. But Colombia is not far behind as are other countries in changing. Mexico, which had such an enormous rate of increase between 99 and 2006, in the last 5 or 8 years has really slowed down. But that's because they increased so much, they were already among the fattest in the world, so the changes were very tiny thereafter. But when you look at Latin America and you compare it with other regions, you see Latin America is, in terms of annualized rate of change. That means if we had 100 million people in a country and 1 million became overweight, that would be 1% there. 1.13 means over 1% a year of people are becoming overweight in the total adult women population. So you see Latin America as one of the leaders, along with South Asia, in getting overweight. And you see really in all the regions we're getting more overweight. And you look and you see in rural areas in some of the regions it started going faster. And that is indeed what's happening in more countries than not. The rate of change is going up in rural areas. And this is comparing the earlier period with nationally representative surveys to the most recent, and you see some countries have accelerated their rate of change, like Brazil. Mexico, actually the rate of change has slowed down, but that doesn't mean it's not getting fatter, it just means the rate of change has really slowed down in the last survey done there, Ensanu 2012. The rest of the region, you see the differences, and Bolivia and Haiti, of course, have had economic crises which have cut the rates of increase and so forth. But the point is, we're all overweight. So now I want to change and talk about preschoolers. And this is where the triple burden comes in when we talk about preschoolers and we talk about their mothers. That's the only data we have across the region. We don't have all ages of kids. If we did, it would be a very different picture. We have a lot more overweight because children and adolescents are much more overweight than preschoolers in this region and much less likely to be anemic. So I'm talking now about where we have data, which is young children, women of childbearing age, and stunting is when they're very short. Most of the stunting in this region occurs between 2 and 12, 14 months of age from bad foods being fed post breastfeeding or infant formula feeding. That's the guts of the stunting problem. The anemia problem is much more varied, and the causes are much more varied across the region, and it's much less of a poverty problem than the stunting issue. And then we're talking about overweight in children, and I'll talk about overweight in adult women. Again, and obesity, combining both. And the BMI over 2 Z-scores or weight for height over 2 are the standard kind of ways that we measure this in children. And when we talk about this country and we look at stunting, we have in some countries a great deal of stunting. You can see the clusters. You can see Colombia's in the middle. You can see the countries that have done much better, particularly Chile, has really targeted the problem. Now Mexico and Brazil have targeted problems toward that and are moving faster toward removing it. But you see that. Now we move to adding in anemia. And we see a large number of countries in children have about the same proportion. Not all that high, but 8 to 10, 12%. We'd like to certainly see much less, but because it has a significant effect on learning and cognitive development. And then we have a couple countries, yours here, that have done better, but really across the whole region, in children, it's not such a problem. It's not such a big problem compared to stunting. But we don't understand it fully. Now when we move ahead and we put them all together and we look at the countries that have this burden, you see the anemia, you see the clusters. That's all three. I'm sorry, I went quickly. That was the cluster of the triple burden, actually, that I was trying to show here, with all three of them together in the proportions. But the point I want to make now is, now I want to bring in women and show you. So we have, as you know, every one of our countries has really today over half the proportion of women overweight and obese. And it's not just the overweight women in the Americas, because you can have a BMI of 21, 22, 23 and be in the Andean region up and down to the Indian population or have some Indian blood in you, and you can be pre-diabetic or diabetic. So genetically, Latinos up and down from Mexico down at a lower BMI are at risk. So this is the tip of the iceberg of the diabetes problem in this region. And then we add in the anemia. And we see that there are some countries with high levels, and then the rest of the countries are actually not so badly off. And that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to give you a sense of that double and triple burden, and that it's much more stunting and overweight. And the stunting problem is a targeted problem. It is a problem of finding low-income populations and dealing with proper weaning food. It is not a total food supply problem. It is a quality of food for infants and toddlers. So it's a very different problem, which is why Chile solved it with very targeted programs, and why Brazil and Mexico and other countries are working on targeted solutions for that problem. That is different than the overweight problem, which is across the spectrum, and rich and poor, and the food system is reaching everybody. And one of the problems that I didn't talk about, if I'd shown you, was that some of that weaning food today is now that junk food. So that we have a confluence now. Infants are getting soft drinks. Infants are getting potato chips. Gosh, I went with my goddaughter from Chiapas, who's a Mayan Indian in the village, and her parents give her chips, and she's 2 years old, toddling around in this Mayan festival. That is what's happening in this region. So it is a confluence. That food system that affects obesity is also now affecting the poor and malnutrition. And that is one of the messages we have to think about. So it's the quality of the diet. It's not, and that is what was echoed, and that is what Dr. Montero, Carlos will echo again. And so in some ways I'm setting the stage for him to come in to talk about what the revolution we truly need and what we're eating and how we get there. He'll talk about his way. My way would be get rid of the other food and set the stage to get healthy food back into our diet. Thank you.